Hello everyone, and today we are going to do the first chapter of class 10 book Footprints Without Feet. The name of this chapter is A Triumph of Surgery, written by James Herriot. The story is basically about a dog named Tricky who was so overfed by his owner that one day he fell ill. And his veterinary doctor, Mr. Herriot, treats him in such a way that he comes back to life and energy again. So to know what happens in the story, we'll have to read and understand it. I'll read the story in two parts and I'll summarize after every part, after which I will explain the significance of the title, the moral of the story, and at the end we'll do question answers. And before we begin the entire session, let's know something about James Herriot. James Herriot basically was a veterinary doctor, but he was also a writer. So whatever stories he has written are based on his life experiences. Let's read this one and know what happens. James Herriot, also known as James Alfred White, was born on 3rd October 1916 in Sunderland, UK. He was a British veterinary surgeon and writer. He wrote a series of books, each consisting of stories about animals and their owners. He is best known for writing a series of 8 books. The first of this series was If Only They Could Talk, published in 1970. There have been several television and film adaptations of his books, which was All Creatures, Great and Small. He died on 23rd February 1995 in North Yorkshire, England, at the age of 78. A Triumph of Surgery. Triumph means success, and surgery is a place where a doctor or dentist or a veterinary treats his patient. So the meaning of this title is that the way the doctor treated his patient was successful. There was success in his treatment. Tricky, a small dog, is pampered and overfed by his rich mistress. He falls seriously ill and his mistress consults a veterinary surgeon. A veterinary surgeon is a person who treats animals. Does he perform an operation? Does the dog recover? Let's read ahead. I was really worried about Tricky this time. Here I is the narrator, Mr. Herriot, who's a veterinary surgeon. And Tricky is the name of the dog. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress. Pulled up means stopped, and mistress means owner. And I was shocked at his appearance. He had become hugely fat, like a bloated sausage with a leg at each corner. Sausage is a meat snack that is made in a cylindrical shape. His eyes bloodshot and rheumy. Bloodshot means become red, and rheumy means watery. Stared straight ahead and his tongue lolled from his jaws. Lolled means hung loosely. Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain. Mrs. Pumphrey is the name of the mistress or the owner of Tricky. Hastened means quickened. He was so listless, Mr. Herriot. Listless means lacking energy. He seemed to have no energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. Malnutrition means poor diet. So I have been giving him some extras between meals to build him up, some malt and cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much really. And did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? Oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak, I had to relent. Relent means change one's mind. He does love cream cakes and chocolates, so I can't bear to refuse him. I looked down again at the little dog. That was the trouble. Tricky's only fault was greed. He had never been known to refuse food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night. Tackle means finish. And I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't mentioned. One day, when Mr. Harriet was driving his car and he saw Tricky and his owner or his mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey, on the street. When Mr. Harriet saw Tricky, he was really worried because Tricky had become very fat. He literally looked like a sausage with four legs. Now, here the narrator is using a simile where he is drawing a comparison between Tricky and a sausage. Tricky's eyes were completely red, they were watery, and his tongue was out of his mouth, which was hanging loosely. When he met Mrs. Pumphrey, he stopped to talk to her. Mrs. Pumphrey was very worried and she quickly complained that he had become very weak and less energetic. She thought that since Tricky was malnutrition, so she increased his diet and she started to give him malt, cod liver oil, a bowl of Horlicks between the meals. So these were some extra things that she used to feed. When Mr. Harriet asked whether she cut down on sweet things or not, but she said that she could not do it. So she gave him cakes and chocolates also. So that was the problem with Tricky because he was overfed. He was given so many eatables by his owner that he could not digest. And the result was that he had grown very, very fat and less energetic. So Mr. Harriet understood the problem of Tricky and he knew that Tricky had come to a point where he was now greedy of food. He would never refuse food, and if a meal was given to him at any hour of the day or night, he would just simply eat. So basically, he was in a bad eating habit. And Mrs. Pumphrey had not mentioned everything which Mr. Harriet wanted to know. Are you giving him plenty of exercise? Well, he has his little walks with me, as you can see, but Hodgkin, the gardener, has been down with lumbago, so there has been no ring throwing lately. Lumbago is pain in muscles and joints of the lower back, and Hodgkin is the name of the gardener. I tried to sound severe. Severe means rude. Now I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right down and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. Wrung means twisted. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I'm sure you are right, but it is so difficult. So very difficult. She set off, head down along the road, as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. Regime means system. I watched their progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering. Tottering means walking unsteadily along in his little tweed coat. A tweed coat is a coat which is made of a rough surfaced woolen cloth, typically of mixed colors, originally produced in Scotland. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. Drooping means bending and harness means straps. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. When Mr. Harriet asked her whether she was giving plenty of exercise to him or not, at that time she said that her gardener, Mr. Hodgkin, had been down with pain in muscles and joints, and therefore he hasn't been playing with Tricky in ring throwing kind of sport. So now she was taking him for little walks with herself. Mr. Harriet now sounded very rude and he told her that she should cut down on the food right now and give him more exercise If she doesn't do that, he can fall ill. So he should be kept on a very strict diet. Mrs. Pumphrey, though, understood that Mr. Harriet was right, but for her it was very difficult because she was the one who had pampered Tricky a lot. And then after that, she started off back to her home. And Mr. Harriet kept watching the walk of Tricky. Because Tricky was very fat, he could not walk properly, so he was walking unsteadily in his tweed coat. So Tricky belonged to a very rich owner, and Tricky had variety of coats for cold weather and also for rainy weather. But Mr. Harriet could very properly see that Tricky was in trouble due to his bad eating habits. The expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Distraught means extremely worried. Tricky would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. He spent all his time lying on the rug, panting. Panting means breathing heavily. Didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. I had made my plans in advance. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight to be kept under observation. A fortnight or 2 weeks. The poor lady almost swooned. Swooned means fainted. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. Pine means to miss. But I took a firm line. Take a firm line is an idiom here which means treat someone in a firm way. Tricky was very ill and this was the only way to save him. In fact, I thought it best to take him without delay, and followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailings, I marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. Wailings means crying. So Mr. Harriet has expected that he will definitely get a call from Mrs. Pumphrey regarding Tricky's health issues. When Mrs. Pumphrey called, she was extremely worried because Tricky had stopped eating his favorite dishes and he was also vomiting. The entire day he was spending lying on his rug, panting, that is breathing heavily. He wouldn't even go for walks or outside for anything. So then Mr. Harriet knew what to do, and he wanted that Tricky should be out of that house for a period, for a few days, so that he will be able to help Tricky change his eating habits. So he suggested Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky should be hospitalized. Mrs. Pumphrey was really worried and she started to cry because she knew that if she was separated from Tricky, then Tricky will miss her and he would die if he didn't see her. But then Mr. Harriet had to be very firm on this, and he wrapped Tricky and he took him to his hospital because he tried to convince Mrs. Pumphrey that it was best for him to be taken there without any delay because Tricky was really ill and that was the only thing that could save him. The entire staff was aroused. Aroused means awakened, and maids rushed in and out bringing his day bed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys and rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. Realizing that my car would never hold all that stuff, I started to drive away. As I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of the little coats through the window. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. Out on the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. Pathetic means poor or pitiful. I patted the head and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. Wag means move, just like the dogs move their tail. Poor old lad, I said, you haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. Haven't a kick in you is an idiom which means there is no excitement in you. So, when Mr. Harriet was about to leave with Tricky for the hospital, the entire staff and maids of the house started to rush in to get his things. So, what all things did they bring? They brought his day bed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys, rubber rings, then three kinds of bowls, each for breakfast, lunch, and supper. Mr. Harriet realized that that was too much of stuff to hold in his car, so he started to drive off. And just when he moved off, he could see Mrs. Pumphrey, who was crying, threw some coats of Tricky towards him to be taken by him to the hospital. So, when he was on the road, he could look in the mirror and he could see that everyone was in tears. Not just Mrs. Pumphrey, but her entire staff was crying because Tricky was being taken to the hospital. Now, Tricky was lying on the adjacent seat of Mr. Harriet in the car. When Mr. Harriet patted his head, Tricky tried to wag his tail or move his tail a bit just to show that he acknowledged Mr. Harriet's presence. The narrator of this story is a veterinary doctor and his name is Mr. Harriet. And one day when Mr. Harriet was driving a car on the street, he saw Mrs. Pumphrey and her dog Tricky. He knew them well beforehand, but when Mr. Harriet saw Tricky, he was a little worried because Tricky had grown so fat that he could not even walk. Mrs. Pumphrey, that is Tricky's owner, was a very rich lady. And she loved Tricky so much that she pampered him and overfed him because she thought that Tricky had gone malnutritioned. And so she used to feed all those things which a dog is not supposed to have. She had been giving him too much of food throughout the day and no exercise at all. And which is why Tricky had become so fat and lethargic. Tricky fell ill. He started to vomit. He stopped eating any kind of food or even going outside. Mrs. Pumphrey was very tensed, so she called Mr. Harriet. Mr. Harriet exactly knew what to do, and so he advised her to hospitalize Tricky for at least 14 days so that he can treat him there. At first, Mrs. Pumphrey was little disheartened because she was going to miss Tricky, but then she understood that at the end it was only for Tricky's benefit. So Mr. Harriet took Tricky with him to the hospital, and while leaving for the hospital, the maids and the servants of that house picked up all Tricky's stuff, that is his bowls, his coats, his beds, his playing rings, everything, and put it in the car for him to be convenient in the hospital. Now let's see in the second part what happens in the hospital, and is Mr. Harriet able to treat Tricky in a way he wanted to? Let's read and understand the next part of the story. At the surgery. Surgery is a place where a doctor treats his patient. The household dogs surged round me. Surged means rushed. So there were other dogs also, and when they saw Tricky there, they all rushed towards Mr. Harriet. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes and when put down lay motionless on the carpet. Here pack means pack of dogs. A group of dogs is called as a pack. The other dogs, after sniffing around him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. For 2 days I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. Whimper means whine or cry. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe. Engulfed means surrounded. and Joe is the name of another dog which belonged to the breed of Greyhound. Greyhound is the breed of dog. And his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. When Mr. Harriet came back to his surgery, other dogs which were there in the surgery came rushing towards him. They looked at Tricky, but since Tricky was not showing any interest, he was motionless and dull, the other dogs also just smelled him and ignored him, and they went away. Mr. Harriet made up a bed for Tricky with a loose box. Now, a point to be noted here is that he did not use the bed which Mrs. Pumphrey had given him. So he made a simple kind of a box into a bed and kept it near other dogs. For the next 2 days, he kept observing him. For 2 days, he did not give any food to Tricky, but he gave plenty of water because by vomiting, Tricky had been really dehydrated. So he needed more and more water to replenish himself. So at the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in the surroundings or in the other dogs. And on the third day, when he heard the barking of other dogs in the yard, he also started to whine or cry. Then on the third day, Mr. Harriet opened the door and Tricky went out. The moment Tricky went out, there was another dog named Joe who belonged to the breed of Greyhound, and with that other dogs as well came towards him. They started to inspect him. But the other dogs did not harm Tricky, and they all moved away and started to run around. Tricky also started to follow them, but since Tricky was very fat, he could not walk properly, yet he tried to walk towards them. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. Tristan was the name of a person who put food into the bowls of those dogs. There was the usual headlong rush followed by the sounds of high-speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. Jostling means rushing. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medical treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. Scrimmages means rough or confused struggle. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, tramped on, and squashed every few minutes. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew. Shaggy crew is referred to the other dogs, which are hairy. Fighting like a tiger for his share at mealtimes and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He had never had such a time in his life. Later on the third day, he was present there in front of the bowls of the dogs when Tristan tried to put the food. All the dogs rushed towards the bowl because every dog knew that if he was late, then he will have to compete or he will have to fight for the food which was left behind. After all the dogs had finished eating, Tricky went to those bowls and he started to lick one or two pieces out of them. Now Mr. Harriet was sure that Tricky wanted to eat. He was hungry. So next day, Mr. Harriet kept an extra bowl for Tricky and he put food in it, which Tricky ate very happily. He was also pleased to see how Tricky rushed towards his bowl just like other dogs did. So slowly, Tricky now had started to gain his strength and energy. And after that, his progress was very fast. Tricky was not given any medicines. All he did throughout the day was he just ran with other dogs. He played with other dogs. He felt so joyful when he joined his other friends, his other dogs. And the other dogs used to trample him, crush him, or push him aside, but Tricky really enjoyed all these activities. In the day, they used to share the meal times, and at night, they all used to hunt rats. Mr. Harriet thought that Tricky must not have ever experienced this kind of life or these kind of activities ever in his life. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. Hovered means observe, try to be around to observe something. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. Convalescing means recovering. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. When Mrs. Pumphrey came to know that Tricky was recovering, she became very anxious, and frequently she used to call Mr. Harriet to know about his well-being. She tried to ask whether his cushions were being turned regularly or not, whether he was being wearing the correct kind of coat according to the weather or not. But Mr. Harriet was very intelligent. He tried to avoid all such questions from her. And then, when she heard that Tricky was recovering, that recovering word seemed to interest Mrs. Pumphrey so much that she started to supply a lot of eatables and wine, etc., just for Tricky. So she used to send 2 dozens of eggs to build up Tricky's strength, and then with some wine, etc. But Tricky was not supposed to eat all that. So what had happened with all those kind of food and wine? Mr. Harriet and his partners had those eggs in the breakfast, and the wine which was sent by Mrs. Pumphrey also was taken by Mr. Harriet and his partners during or before the meals. So for him and his partners, this entire thing had become a ceremony with extra supply of eggs, wine, etc. The life for Mr. Harriet had become very joyful. And on the other hand, Tricky was on a strict diet because Mr. Harriet did not want him to fall sick again. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. To put final edge on is an idiom which means to force stop. For a few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled and reverently drunk. There were days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. 30 feet of gleaming black metal means 30 feet long, shining black car. Drew up means come or stopped. The chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey, almost lost in the interior. Chauffeur means driver. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her lips trembled. Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better? Yes, he is fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him. Fetch him means bring him. Mrs. Pumphrey started sending in brandy, and at that time Mr. Harriet was not able to believe that Mrs. Pumphrey actually wanted them to give brandy to Tricky. Brandy is a liquor, but it is also used for medicinal purposes in case of cough and cold. They shared it amongst themselves, and some days Mr. Harriet used to feel very happy when he used to start his day with extra eggs. Then he would have a few glasses of wine in the afternoon and end his day with brandy in the evening. So all these things were so joyous for Mr. Harriet that he wanted Tricky to be his permanent guest, because then he would get continuous supply of all these things, which he really enjoyed. But Mrs. Pumphrey was really suffering, so Mr. Harriet called Mrs. Pumphrey to collect Tricky from him, and within a few minutes Mrs. Pumphrey's 30 feet long, shining car came near the surgery. The driver opened the door, but Mrs. Pumphrey did not come outside. She was really nervous and she wanted to see Tricky. And Mr. Harriet told her that he'll get Tricky from inside himself. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was a little golden figure of Tricky. Hurtling means racing. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, hard-muscled animal. Lithe means very flexible and thin. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled "Oh!" and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her. Swarmed means crushed, licking her face and barking. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats, and bowls, none of which had been used. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes, her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." When Mr. Harriet went to the garden behind the house, he saw all the dogs moving around in the garden, and Tricky was between them. He had recovered wonderfully in 2 weeks. He was looking much healthier, leaner, and muscled animal. He had been in the habit of playing with other dogs. He had become a good muscular dog within these 2 weeks. When Mr. Harriet took Tricky to the front of the house, he saw that the chauffeur was still holding the door of the car open, and as soon as Tricky saw his mistress, he was overjoyed. He ran away and jumped into the lap of Mrs. Pumphrey and started licking her face, barking in excitement. And while this was happening, the chauffeur, that is the driver, and Mr. Harriet got all his stuff out to the car, which had not been used during the treatment in the last 14 days. So in other words, Tricky was given a normal life in contrast to that luxurious life which he had at Mrs. Pumphrey's house, because all his toys, his beds, his bowls, his coats, everything was unused. Tricky was kept in the same manner as other dogs were, and that is why maybe Tricky could gel with the other dogs, or he could befriend, he could play so well with the other dogs in these 14 days. When Mrs. Pumphrey was leaving, she leaned out of the window and she told Mr. Harriet that it was a triumph of surgery. By this, she meant that the treatment which Mr. Harriet had given to Tricky had been absolutely successful. When Mr. Harriet came to his surgery, that is the place where he treated his patients, he was surrounded by a lot of other dogs which were there already. But when they saw that Tricky was not very interested, he lay motionless, the other dogs also just smelled and went away. For the first 2 days, Mr. Harriet did not give Tricky any food. He just gave him plenty of water because Tricky was completely dehydrated because of vomiting. Once the water was replenished in his body, on the 3rd day, when he saw that Tricky was moving towards the bowls of the other dogs, then he gave some food to Tricky, and then he opened the door so that the Tricky could go out and play with the other dogs. And this routine followed. Mr. Harriet treated Tricky in such a way that he was completely in a different environment than how he was at home. At home, he was really pampered. He was given a lot of food. He was not given any exercise. He was given complete comfort and coziness. But on the contrast, here at Mr. Harriet, he was treated just like the other dogs. Mr. Harriet did not use his bed or his rugs or his coats, the bowls that Mrs. Pumphrey had given, nothing at all. And Tricky was allowed to play with the other dogs and he used to run in the lawn with the other dogs. This system went on till 14 days, and at the end of the 14th day, Tricky was up and about. From a very fatty dog, he had changed to a hard-muscled, thin and energetic dog. But during this treatment, Mrs. Pumphrey was very concerned about Tricky's diet. So every day she used to send eggs and wine and brandy. Of course, Mr. Harriet did not give all these things to Tricky, so he consumed everything himself with his partners. And there is an instance in the story also that Mr. Harriet was so happy that he did not want Tricky to go from there, as the supply of all these things would be stopped. But at the end of the 14th day, Mr. Harriet called Mrs. Pumphrey back to collect Tricky. When Tricky met Mrs. Pumphrey, he was so excited that he jumped in the car and he licked and barked at her excitedly. Mrs. Pumphrey had tears in her eyes. Those were the tears of happiness because she couldn't believe that Tricky had changed so much. And while going, she uttered one sentence, that it was a triumph of surgery. What does that mean? Let's do it in significance of the title. The title, A Triumph of Surgery, is very appropriate to this story. Firstly, because Mr. Harriet had been very tactful in treating Tricky. Instead of putting him on medicines, he knew exactly what to do with him. His agenda was to let Tricky lose his weight and become more energetic than before. And this could be achieved by controlling his diet. Mr. Harriet did exactly this and he achieved his aim. So the treatment which Mr. Harriet gave to Tricky was entirely successful and healthy. And therefore, it is a triumph of surgery. That is a victory of the operation or the surgery that he had handled with Tricky. Now let's understand the moral of the story. Anything in excess is always bad, be it love or be it food. Mrs. Pumphrey used to overly love Tricky so much that she kept on feeding him the food. So her overgiving of love and food both had taken a toll on Tricky. And what was the result? That he fell ill. In the same manner, if we give excess love or if we eat excess food, that both can be harmful to the other person. So we need not indulge in anything excessive, but take a middle road and be little balanced in our life. Coming to our lifestyle, we should have a balanced diet and an exercise so that we remain healthy at the end of the day. So with that, we end today's session. I hope you understood this lesson and I enjoyed it bringing to you. Now let me flash the question answers related to it, and I'll see you again in the next video with a new topic. Till then, take good care of yourself, keep smiling and take care. Bye.